The lake had once been the pride of the neighborhood. Years ago, when the houses were first built, people used to walk along its edge every evening. Children threw small stones into the water, couples sat on benches, and older residents fed the ducks. Over time, things slowly changed. The water level dropped, the surface turned dark, and thick weeds began to cover the edges. Trash started appearing: plastic bottles, broken branches, even old tires. The smell became hard to ignore, especially during summer. People complained, but only in passing. No one truly believed it would ever be fixed. The Homeowners Association talked about the lake often, but nothing ever happened. Meetings ended with excuses about budgets, permits, and waiting lists. Each year, the promises sounded the same. Some residents stopped attending meetings altogether. Others accepted the lake as a lost cause. It became something people warned guests about instead of showing off. Windows facing the water stayed closed. Walks were shortened. Slowly, the lake stopped being a place people cared about. One resident lived in a small house close enough to see the lake every day. From his back window, he could see how bad it had become. He noticed things others didn't, like how birds no longer landed near the water and how insects gathered in thick clouds. Some mornings he woke up to the smell before he even opened the door. He tried ignoring it, telling himself it wasn't his responsibility. But the lake was always there, quiet and forgotten. Almost like it was waiting for someone to notice it again. He remembered how the lake looked when he first moved in. Back then, the water reflected the sky. Even simple moments felt peaceful. Those memories stayed with him, and the contrast became hard to accept. Each time the HOA delayed action, his frustration grew. He wasn't angry at anyone in particular. It was more a feeling of sadness, mixed with disappointment. Everyone expected someone else to fix it. That someone never came. One afternoon, after another long day, he walked closer to the lake than usual. He stood there, looking at the weeds and trash, and felt a sudden sense of clarity. Complaining had changed nothing. Waiting had changed nothing. He didn't have a plan, and he didn't feel brave. He just felt tired of seeing something slowly die while everyone looked away. That was the moment he decided to do something, even if it was small. He started the next morning with gloves and a trash bag. There was no announcement and no audience. He picked up what he could reach: bottles, cans, and plastic bags stuck in the weeds. It was slow and unpleasant work. The smell was strong, and the ground was muddy. His back hurt within an hour. Still, when he looked at the filled trash bags, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't pride. It was relief. Over the next few days, he kept going. Sometimes he worked before sunrise. Sometimes just before dark. He avoided attention, stopping whenever someone walked by. He didn't want questions. He didn't want approval. He just wanted progress. Bit by bit, the shoreline began to look different. The trash disappeared. The water near the edge looked slightly clearer. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. He spent evenings researching simple, natural ways to help the lake recover. After weeks of quiet work, the changes to the lake became more noticeable. The water was clearer near the edges, and the weeds were thinning. Birds had started returning, perching on the few branches that had survived and dipping their beaks into the water. Even the air around the lake felt different, fresher somehow. The resident continued his routine, waking up early to work before anyone else was around and finishing late in the evening. He had learned to enjoy the quiet moments, the ones when the water reflected the sunrise and the world seemed to pause. Neighbors began to notice the small but significant improvements. Some stopped their cars to look at the lake. A few walked by slowly, observing the work with curiosity. One day, a mother with a small child lingered by the edge. The child pointed at a bird and laughed. The mother smiled and whispered, "It feels like the lake is alive again." The resident watched from a distance, smiling to himself. He didn't want attention, but the quiet acknowledgement gave him a small sense of reward. He faced challenges almost every day. Some days the water had turned cloudy after a rainfall, or new trash appeared from people passing by. He learned to deal with frustration calmly. He would remove the debris and adjust his approach. Sometimes he tried planting small patches of grass near the edges, only to see them washed away. Other times, invasive weeds seemed to grow back faster than he could remove them. Each setback tested his patience, but he kept going. He reminded himself that progress often came slowly, and he had already seen enough change to know it was possible. As he worked, he also learned from the lake itself. Observing the patterns of birds, fish, and insects gave him ideas on what to do next. He experimented carefully, trying different methods of cleaning the water without harming the wildlife. He avoided chemical solutions knowing they could cause more problems. Instead, he used natural methods, researched online, or suggested by environmental experts, to improve water quality and reduce weeds. Each small victory, like the return of a bird family or a clearer patch of water, gave him a quiet sense of accomplishment. People in the neighborhood slowly became more aware of his efforts. Some offered small help, like carrying tools or removing larger trash items. Others watched from a distance but didn't approach. A few even commented on social media, posting pictures of the changes without knowing who had done the work. The resident remained anonymous. He liked the idea that the lake was improving without the need for recognition. For him, the transformation itself was reward enough. He also kept careful notes. Each day, he recorded what he did and the changes he observed. Water clarity, bird sightings, plant growth, everything was logged. He felt it might be useful later if someone asked questions or if the HOA ever got involved. These records became a personal diary of the lake's revival, and reviewing them gave him motivation to continue. He could see patterns forming, subtle progress that would have been easy to miss without written notes. Some days were physically exhausting. Bending, lifting, carrying, and planting took a toll on his body. He sometimes returned home with muddy clothes and scratches from the plants and debris. Yet each evening he would glance at the lake before entering his house, and the sense of satisfaction outweighed the fatigue. He had never done something so demanding yet so rewarding in his life. Evening walks by the lake became his moments of reflection. He thought about why so many people had ignored the problem for so long. He wondered how fear of responsibility or lack of initiative could allow something so central to a community to fall into neglect. He didn't judge. He simply observed. His focus remained on what he could do, not what others should have done. Meanwhile, word continued to spread quietly. Neighbors who were once indifferent now talked about the lake with curiosity and a hint of hope. Some shared memories of better times by the water, recalling picnics, evening walks, and celebrations. The resident listened and smiled quietly. He felt the lake becoming a shared memory again. Even though most people didn't know he was responsible for the change, his work attracted small moments of connection too. An elderly man once brought an old photograph of the lake when it was clean and vibrant. They compared the image to the current state, discussing what could be done to restore it further. A teenager mentioned how the lake could be a good spot for painting or photography. These small interactions reminded him that the lake had a life beyond his own efforts. Others would eventually care for it too, he hoped, once they saw the difference. Despite the progress, he remained cautious. The HOA had a reputation for strict rules and sudden intervention. He knew that any discovery could lead to questions or complaints, so he continued to work quietly, choosing times when fewer people were around and avoiding any unnecessary attention. He didn't want confrontation. He wanted improvement. One morning he discovered that a section of the lake had become murky again after heavy rain. Instead of frustration, he felt determination. He quickly cleared debris and adjusted his planting strategy to prevent future problems. That day, he also observed small fish returning, darting in the shallow water near the edges. It was a small miracle for him, proof that his work was having an effect. These little moments strengthened his resolve. Over time, the lake began to look alive again. Patches of green appeared along the edges. Birds returned in larger numbers. The water reflected the sky more clearly. Even the smell was no longer overwhelming. Residents began to smile as they passed by, and some started walking along the paths they had long ignored. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. By the end of the second month, The lake looked like a place that could belong to the neighborhood once more. The residents' quiet dedication had begun to inspire small changes in attitude. People began imagining the lake as a place to gather again, even if they didn't yet know who had done the work. The resident continued his routine, happy to see the first signs of life returning. He never sought recognition, yet he felt a growing connection with the community. Each improvement was not only a personal victory, but also a shared one. And while he enjoyed the solitude of his work, he could sense that something larger was about to happen. Soon, the lake would attract attention from those who had long ignored it. And when that day came, he knew everything might change. One calm morning, as the resident worked along the lake, a car slowly drove past. Inside, several members of the Homeowners Association were talking, though he could not hear their conversation. What he did notice was the car stopping near the edge of the lake. Two people got out and began walking toward the water, clipboards in hand, their expressions serious. They were the first HOA representatives he had seen in months. He stopped what he was doing and stepped back, sure of what they would say. The HOA members inspected the lake carefully, pointing and taking notes. One of them bent down, poked at a section of water, and frowned. They walked along the edge, occasionally looking up at nearby homes and back at the lake. The resident stayed hidden, watching quietly. He wanted to be prepared for questions, but also hoped they wouldn't confront him immediately. He didn't know if they would be angry, impressed, or simply confused. After a few minutes, one of the HOA members spoke to a passing neighbor, asking who had been working on the lake. The neighbor shrugged, unsure. It was clear they had heard about changes, but did not yet know who was responsible. The resident realized that his anonymity had kept the work safe for now, but the secret would not last much longer. He took a deep breath and decided he could face whatever came next, as long as he remained calm. The HOA members continued to inspect the lake, occasionally taking photos and discussing maintenance rules. They seemed surprised by how much the area had improved. One of them pointed to the shoreline where trash had been cleared and weeds trimmed, and muttered something that sounded like disbelief. The resident felt a mixture of nervousness and satisfaction. Weeks of hard work had created something noticeable, but he had no idea if it would be appreciated or criticized. Finally, one of the HOA members spoke directly, addressing the resident without knowing he was there. They asked the neighbor where the person responsible for the lake restoration could be found. The resident stepped forward slowly. The HOA members turned, surprised to see someone emerge from the nearby bushes. They looked him over, unsure whether to be angry or curious. The resident introduced himself calmly and explained that he had been working on the lake for weeks. There was a pause. The HOA members exchanged glances, clearly taken aback. They began asking questions: what he had done, how he had funded it, and whether he had received any permissions. The resident answered honestly, admitting that he had acted without official approval. He emphasized that his intention had only been to improve the lake and restore life to the area. He had kept careful records and photos she showed to them as proof of the changes and methods he had used. The situation grew tense. The HOA members spoke in a low, serious tone, explaining rules and regulations. They mentioned permits, liability concerns, and community policies. At first, it seemed as if all his effort might be dismissed or even penalized. He listened quietly, understanding their position. He had expected some confrontation, but he hoped his honesty and dedication would make a difference. While the discussion was ongoing, several neighbors began to gather, curious about the commotion. Some recognized the lake had changed and whispered among themselves. A few approached, asking questions about who had done the work. The resident stayed patient, allowing the neighbors to witness his commitment firsthand. He realized that their support might be important in influencing the HOA's final decision. One elderly neighbor stepped forward, speaking on his behalf. He explained how the lake had been neglected for years and praised the residents' efforts. Other neighbors nodded in agreement, sharing small stories about the lake's past and how it had once been a central part of the community. Their voices added weight to the situation, creating a mix of admiration and quiet pressure on the HOA members. The resident felt grateful that people were recognizing the importance of his work, The HOA members looked around, realizing that the community had noticed the lake's transformation. Their tone shifted slightly, from strict authority to cautious consideration. They reviewed the evidence and listened to the neighbors. The resident calmly explained the methods he had used, emphasizing that they were safe, natural, and eco-friendly. He wanted to ensure that the improvements would last and that no harm had been done. The HOA members seemed to be processing the information, their initial stern attitude softening. Hours passed as the discussion continued. The resident demonstrated the planting techniques, the debris removal methods, and the water cleaning strategies. He explained how he had observed wildlife returning and how he had avoided harmful chemicals. The HOA members took notes and asked occasional clarifying questions. The neighbors continued to watch, silently showing support through their presence. As the sun began to set, the atmosphere shifted. The HOA members looked at the lake again, seeing not a neglected body of water, but a space that had been restored with care and attention. The birds were still visible, insects hovered harmlessly, and the water reflected the last rays of sunlight. The resident felt a sense of relief, realizing that his hard work was being recognized, even if it was in an unexpected and slow way. The HOA members finally paused, taking a step back. They acknowledged the effort and noted the positive impact on the community. While they reminded him that certain procedures should have been followed, there was no immediate reprimand. Instead, they discussed how they could incorporate his work into a community-approved plan. The resident listened quietly, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and humility. He had acted alone, but now it seemed that the changes might benefit the whole neighborhood officially. The neighbors clapped quietly, some cheering softly, celebrating the lake's revival. The resident felt a warmth he had not expected from this confrontation. The lake had not only returned to life, but it also brought the community together, even in this tense situation. He realized that what had begun as a solitary effort had transformed into a shared achievement, and the impact was far greater than he had imagined by the end of the day. The HOA members left with a plan to discuss further improvements. They promised to consider the residents' methods in future projects and acknowledged that the community's support was essential. The resident continued to tidy up small areas of the lake, reflecting on the unusual day. He realized that sometimes taking action, even without permission, could lead to meaningful change when done with care and honesty. That evening, as he walked home, he glanced back at the lake. It was calm, clean, and alive. The tension from the day slowly eased, replaced by a quiet pride. He knew that more challenges might come, but he also knew that the lake had a chance to become a central part of the community once more. The confrontation with the HOA had been unexpected, but it had also revealed the power of dedication, patience, and community support. And for the first time in a long while, the lake seemed truly ready to thrive again. After the confrontation with the HOA, life around the lake slowly began to change. The resident continued his routine, carefully maintaining the areas he had worked on. He made small improvements each day, trimming new growth, planting more native plants, and keeping the shoreline clean. The difference was striking. The water was clearer, the edges tidy, and the wildlife returned steadily. Ducks and birds now visited regularly, and small fish could be seen swimming near the shore. The resident felt a deep satisfaction, knowing that the lake was finally alive again. Neighbors who had once ignored the lake now began to engage. Some stopped by to ask questions, curious about what had been done. A few brought small tools or supplies to help, though most still watched quietly. One family came with sandwiches and drinks and sat near the water, enjoying a peaceful moment by the restored lake. Children ran along the paths, pointing at ducks and frogs. For the first time in years, the lake had become a place of enjoyment rather than neglect. The resident watched from a distance, quietly pleased that his work was inspiring others to reconnect with this part of the community. The HOA continued to check on the lake from time to time. Their attitude had softened, but they were still cautious. They asked for updates and occasional records of the work. The resident complied willingly, happy to show that all methods were safe and sustainable. Surprisingly, they even suggested incorporating some of his ideas into an official community plan. The resident remained humble. He had not sought recognition, but he was glad that his efforts could help the neighborhood in a meaningful way. Small events started happening around the lake. A local artist came by to paint the scene, setting up an easel on the bank. A few residents took morning walks, pointing out flowers and birds. Conversations turned from complaints about neglect to stories about the past and hopes for the future. The lake had become a gathering place, not just for nature, but for the community itself. The resident felt a sense of pride and relief, knowing that his work had created more than just a restored body of water. It had renewed a sense of connection among neighbors. One morning, he noticed that a small group of children had gathered with buckets and nets, cautiously exploring the shallow areas. They were curious and careful, asking questions about the fish and plants. Parents stood nearby, smiling and encouraging exploration. The resident approached slowly and explained how certain plants help keep the water clean and how fish and birds interacted with the environment. The children listened attentively, and the parents nodded appreciatively. It was a small but powerful moment of teaching and learning, showing how the lake could be a place of education as well as beauty. He also faced new challenges. Some sections of the lake needed reinforcement to prevent erosion. Debris continued to appear from runoff or careless visitors. He adjusted his methods, using natural materials and subtle barriers to protect vulnerable areas. Each problem was a learning opportunity. He documented everything not for recognition, but to ensure that the improvements would last and that future caretakers could understand what had been done. His careful approach made the lake more resilient, allowing it to thrive in ways it had not in years. The lake became a topic of discussion at community gatherings. People shared their observations, praising the changes and sharing stories from the past. Older residents recalled picnics and celebrations, while younger residents enjoyed discovering nature up close. The HOA members listened quietly at times, clearly impressed by the widespread appreciation. The resident stayed in the background, letting the community enjoy the lake without drawing attention to himself. It was a quiet victory, showing that genuine effort could create change without fanfare. Unexpectedly, the lake began attracting attention beyond the immediate neighborhood. Passersby from nearby streets stopped to take photographs or simply enjoy the view. Social media posts began circulating, showing before and after images of the restoration. The resident remained anonymous, but he could see that the impact of his work extended far beyond what he had imagined. The lake, once forgotten, had become a point of pride and curiosity for many. One day, a local environmental group contacted the resident. They had noticed the improvements and wanted to understand what had been done. He shared his methods and experiences, emphasizing natural, safe techniques and the importance of patience. The group offered guidance and support, suggesting ways to further improve the lake and make the project sustainable in the long term. The resident welcomed the advice, happy that the lake could continue to flourish with additional expertise and community involvement. The sense of community around the lake strengthened. Residents began organizing small cleanups, bringing flowers, and planting additional native plants. Children learned to respect the water and wildlife, while adults shared knowledge and memories. The HOA, once distant and strict, now participated occasionally, supporting community-led projects and acknowledging the value of citizen initiative. The lake had become a symbol of collaboration, showing that one person's dedication could spark broader change. The resident often reflected on his journey. He remembered the early days when he had worked alone, unsure if anything would improve. He thought about the challenges, the setbacks, and the long hours. He realized that perseverance, combined with respect for nature and the community, had been the key to success. The lake had become more than a project. It was a living example of what care, patience, and quiet determination could achieve. Evenings at the lake were peaceful. The water reflected the sky, and the sounds of birds, frogs, and gentle waves created a sense of calm. Families and individuals strolled along the paths, sharing quiet moments and laughter. The residents sometimes paused to watch, feeling a quiet sense of pride and contentment. He had not sought recognition or reward, yet the lake had become a shared treasure, valued by many. By the end of this phase of restoration, the lake looked alive, vibrant, and welcoming. Wildlife thrived, plants flourished, and the community had embraced the space once again. The resident continued his work, but now it was supported, observed with appreciation, and occasionally joined by neighbors. The lake was no longer forgotten, and it had become a symbol of what one person's initiative, combined with community involvement, could achieve. What had started as a solitary effort had transformed into a collective success, and the resident knew that this was only the beginning of a lasting positive change. Months passed, and the lake continued to thrive. What had once been a forgotten, neglected space was now alive with color, sound, and movement. Ducks and birds visited regularly, fish swam near the edges, and wildflowers bloomed along the shoreline. Families came to enjoy quiet afternoons, children laughed and played, and neighbors stopped to chat or simply take in the view. The resident walked along the lake each day, reflecting on how much had changed since he first decided to act alone. The HOA had become more involved, but in a supportive way. They now checked the lake occasionally to ensure rules were followed, but they also praised the improvements. They asked the resident for advice on planting, debris management, and wildlife protection. It was a dramatic shift from the strict scrutiny they had shown during their first confrontation. Their acknowledgement felt like validation, but the resident remained humble. He had never wanted recognition. He only wanted the lake to live again. Word about the lake began to spread beyond the immediate neighborhood. Local photographers came to capture its beauty.
Ow!
Bloggers wrote about the restoration, and environmental groups mentioned it as an example of community-driven work. The resident rarely gave interviews, preferring to stay out of the spotlight. But he shared his methods with experts and enthusiasts who genuinely wanted to learn. It became a quiet legacy of knowledge, showing that patience, dedication, and respect for nature could create lasting change. Children had grown to love the lake as much as he did. They knew which areas were safe to explore and which plants to leave alone. Parents watched them play, often stopping to talk with neighbors or share a moment of relaxation. The lake had become a classroom, a playground, and a sanctuary all at once. The resident occasionally guided children and adults alike, explaining simple ecological principles, the importance of clean water, and how small actions could have a big impact. These teaching moments felt just as rewarding as the labor itself. Some neighbors had joined in on their own initiatives, planting flowers, picking up trash, or building small benches for resting. Community pride grew. People who had once ignored the lake now felt responsible for its care. Even the shyest residents would pause to admire the water, remark on the birds, or help in small ways. The lake had become a point of connection, a shared space that encouraged kindness and cooperation. The resident watched quietly, feeling grateful that others had embraced the same vision he had worked toward alone. One evening, a group of local officials visited, curious about how a single person had achieved such a transformation. The resident explained the work step by step, showing photos, notes, and his methods. The officials were impressed by the careful, eco-friendly approach and asked how it could be replicated elsewhere. The resident emphasized patience, observation, and respect for the environment. He reminded them that the key was consistent small efforts rather than grand immediate changes. His words carried weight because the results were undeniable. Despite the lake's restoration, the residents still encountered challenges. Heavy rains occasionally caused runoff, debris sometimes appeared, and certain plants required extra care. Each time, he adapted, learning from the experience. His understanding of the ecosystem deepened. He realized that restoration was not a one-time project, but an ongoing relationship with the environment. This mindset helped him stay motivated and informed, and it encouraged the community to participate responsibly. As the seasons changed, the lake reflected each one beautifully. Spring brought blossoms, summer warmth, autumn painted the leaves golden, and winter's frost created sparkling patterns on the water. Residents took photographs, walked along the shore, and shared moments with friends and family. The lake had become a living calendar, marking time with natural beauty. The resident often paused to watch the reflection of the sky, feeling a deep sense of accomplishment. He had nurtured something that others could now enjoy fully, and it filled him with quiet joy. The HOA eventually held a formal meeting near the lake, inviting residents to discuss future care. The resident was asked to speak and share his experiences. He described the early days of solitary work, the challenges he faced, and the methods that had helped the lake thrive. He emphasized the importance of community participation and the value of taking initiative. The audience listened attentively, and many nodded in agreement. It was clear that what had started as one person's effort had inspired an entire community as the years went by. The lake remained a central part of neighborhood life. Families celebrated small events there. Children learned about nature firsthand. Neighbors continued to maintain the space together. The resident's role evolved from a solitary worker to a respected guide, someone who had shown that quiet, persistent effort could bring remarkable change. The lake was no longer forgotten, and its story spread as a symbol of hope and dedication. Looking back, the resident realized how a simple decision to act rather than wait had changed everything. His determination, patience, and respect for both nature and community had revived the lake. More importantly, it had revived the spirit of the neighborhood. People learned to care, to act, and to appreciate the small but meaningful moments. The lake had become more than water and plants. It had become a shared dream made real by effort, courage, and kindness. One final moment captured the essence of the journey. On a quiet morning, the resident stood by the lake as the sun rose. Children ran past, birds chirped, and the water shimmered with light. Neighbors waved from their homes or paths, smiling. The resident smiled back, feeling a sense of fulfillment that words could not describe. The lake had survived neglect, had been restored through dedication, and had brought a community together. What had begun as a personal mission had become a shared triumph, proving that small actions, driven by care and persistence, could create lasting, meaningful change, even after the lake had been fully restored and embraced by the community. The resident continued to be deeply involved. He had developed a routine that balanced maintenance, observation, and education. Mornings were spent checking water clarity and ensuring that plants were healthy. Afternoons often involved talking to neighbors, answering questions about wildlife, and guiding children as they explored the area safely. The lake had become a living classroom, and the resident had become a quiet mentor for anyone who wanted to learn about nature and restoration. The community continued to grow more engaged over time. Families began bringing picnics, neighbors organized small cleanups, and children created little observation journals to track the birds and fish they saw. The lake had transformed from a solitary project into a community hub, and the resident found joy in watching others enjoy it. He noticed that people who had once ignored the lake now felt a sense of ownership and pride. Their small contributions, even as simple as picking up trash or planting a flower, strengthened the overall care of the area. Unexpectedly, the resident faced a new challenge. A large storm had passed through the area one night, bringing heavy rain and strong winds. The next morning, he discovered debris scattered across the lake and surrounding paths, and a few plants had been uprooted. While it was frustrating, he knew this was a natural part of maintaining an outdoor environment. He worked through the day, carefully clearing debris, replanting, and making minor reinforcements to prevent future erosion. The community saw him working and joined in. Turning the task into a collaborative effort, this experience strengthened the sense of togetherness around the lake. People who had never spoken to each other before now worked side by side, sharing tools, ideas, and encouragement. The resident watched quietly, realizing that the lake had become more than a natural space. It was fostering relationships and teaching responsibility. It reminded him that restoration was ongoing, not just a one-time effort. Maintaining the health of the lake required patience, attention, and cooperation. Over time, small educational events began to take place. The resident organized bird-watching mornings, explaining how different species interacted with the lake ecosystem. Children learned how plants helped filter water and how wildlife depended on clean, balanced environments. Parents appreciated these informal lessons, and even some older residents began joining the activities. It was rewarding to see curiosity spark learning, and the resident felt a deep satisfaction knowing the lake was having a positive impact beyond its beauty. the lake also became a source of inspiration. Local artists came to paint or photograph the area, capturing its changing seasons and the life thriving around it. Photographs and paintings were shared in small exhibitions, community boards, and social media, showcasing the restored lake to a wider audience. The resident enjoyed seeing the creative interpretations, feeling proud that his efforts had sparked artistic expression. It reminded him that restoration was not only about nature, but also about enriching lives in various ways. Occasionally, small problems arose. A few visitors left behind trash, or children unknowingly disturbed certain plants. The resident addressed these moments gently, educating visitors rather than scolding them. He encouraged respect for nature and demonstrated simple ways to minimize impact. The community gradually adopted the same mindset, creating a culture of care. Over time, these small lessons accumulated, and the lake remained in a healthy, thriving state. During these months, the resident noticed wildlife returning in ways he had not anticipated. Small mammals appeared near the edges, frogs multiplied in shallow areas, and the variety of bird species increased. Seasonal migrations brought temporary visitors, creating exciting moments for observation. He recorded all of this, continuing his detailed notes as a reference and educational tool. The lake had become a living laboratory, and he felt honored to be part of its ongoing story. The HOA maintained a supportive presence, occasionally checking in and suggesting community-led initiatives. Their tone had shifted entirely from the early days of strict oversight to encouragement and partnership. Together, they discussed possible improvements, such as adding walking paths, benches, and native plant gardens. The resident advised carefully, ensuring that all changes remained environmentally friendly and sustainable. This collaborative effort highlighted how one person's initiative could inspire broader community engagement and effective governance. Community events around the lake continued to increase. Seasonal celebrations, small volunteer projects, and nature-themed gatherings became regular occurrences. The resident observed families sharing stories and laughter, children playing safely, and neighbors bonding over shared responsibilities. The lake was no longer a forgotten corner. It had become the heart of the neighborhood. The sense of connection and shared purpose created a positive atmosphere, demonstrating the lasting impact of one person's dedication. Through all these changes, the resident reflected on his journey. He remembered the early days of frustration, isolation, and slow progress. He thought about how small actions, repeated consistently, had created meaningful change. He recognized that restoration required patience, observation, and the willingness to learn from both successes and failures. These lessons extended beyond the lake, influencing how he approached other aspects of life and interactions within the community. The lake continued to be a place of quiet inspiration. Early mornings brought mist rising from the water. Afternoons offered sun-dappled reflections, and evenings echoed with bird calls and laughter from nearby residents. The resident often paused during his walks to appreciate the subtle details: the ripple of water over pebbles, a flutter of wings, or the shimmer of sunlight on leaves. These moments reminded him of why he had started the project and reinforced the importance of caring for shared spaces. As years passed, HOA became a legacy for the community. New residents arrived, and they quickly learned about its history and significance. Children grew up visiting the lake, learning respect for nature and responsibility for communal spaces. The resident continued to mentor, guide, and maintain, knowing that his work had created lasting value. The lake had evolved from a personal mission into a community treasure, symbolizing perseverance, collaboration, and the power of one person to inspire change. One peaceful evening, the resident watched the sun set over the lake. The water reflected the vibrant colors of the sky. Wildlife moved about freely, and families enjoyed the calm beauty. He thought about how much had changed. From the first day he picked up a trash bag to the thriving, dynamic environment now present. He realized that his actions had created more than a restored lake. They had fostered a community, inspired learning, and nurtured respect for nature. The resident smiled quietly, understanding that the lake's story would continue for generations. A living testament to dedication, patience, and learned about native plants that could reduce erosion and improve water quality. He read about how removing certain weeds could help oxygen levels return. He stayed away from anything harmful or extreme. He knew the lake needed care, not force. Using his own money, he bought basic tools and supplies. Nothing fancy, just enough to help. A few neighbors started to notice the change. At first, they didn't say anything. Some slowed their walks. Others stood quietly for a moment before moving on. One older resident nodded at him once, without a word. Another thanked him softly and kept walking. Most people stayed silent, unsure how to react. They were used to seeing the lake ignored. Seeing someone care felt unusual. The work continued for weeks. The smell faded little by little. Birds returned, first one or two, then more. The water surface looked calmer. In the mornings, light reflected off the lake again, just enough to remind people of what it once was. The resident noticed these changes and felt encouraged, but also nervous. He knew he was acting without permission. He wondered how long it would be before someone official noticed. He told himself he would stop if asked. He wasn't trying to break rules or challenge authority. He simply believed that doing nothing was worse. Each day he worked, he felt more connected to the lake. It no longer felt like a problem. It felt like a responsibility he had accepted, even if no one else had. By the end of the first month, the lake looked different enough that people talked about it openly. Conversations changed from complaints to curiosity. Some wondered who was behind the work. Others guessed it might finally be an HOA project. The resident listened quietly when he passed by, saying nothing. He knew the truth would come out eventually. For now, he focused on the water, the plants, and the slow return of life. What he didn't know was that his quiet effort had already reached the wrong ears. Questions were being asked behind closed doors. Files were being checked. And soon, the people who had ignored the lake for years would come to see it for themselves. When they did, nothing would go the way anyone expected.